Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jeff Forster, and thanks, Joe. Yeah, my mic was muted. I apologize for that. If you want to talk to me, you can use the chat and ask questions. And I may go for a while and then I'll stop and answer some questions from the chat. This is the first in what Minnesota Lakes and Rivers had planned as a summer-long book club in partnership with the Minnesota Historical Society Press. We're very lucky to have the Minnesota Historical Society Press in Minnesota. It is, I think, one of the oldest historical society press in the country. It's one of the largest. They do about 50 titles a year, so almost a book a week, all about Minnesota, Minnesota history, Minnesota lifestyle. And obviously, one of the things that's really a heritage in Minnesota is life at the lake. So the books that we wanted to present were books that really speak to the natural world, life at the lake. There's a kid's book that we'll be announcing shortly. We have two others that you may want to be in on. April 22nd, we're doing Lost in the Wild, which is about two individuals that went into the wilderness and ended up getting lost and having kind of an amazing adventure. And then Canoeing with the Cree, which is a great story about two young men that started out in Minneapolis and paddled up to Hudson Bay and had quite an adventure. The first, Lost in the Wild, is April 22nd. And if you go to our website, www.mnlakesandrivers.org, you'll see it listed there. On May 15th, we're doing Canoeing with the Cree. And we had planned to kind of stretch this out over the summer, but with everybody sheltering at home, we decided to just start out now and kind of get them scheduled as we could get them scheduled. So this is my book, Forest for the Trees, and it's the ecological history of what became the Boundary Waters. And it's a really interesting area for study. Northeastern Minnesota, that area in kind of north of Duluth, is the end of the white pine harvest that began all the way on the East Coast. And white pine were a critically important tree for the English Navy. White pine are tall and straight, and they resist rot, and they're very strong, and they were key for ship masts. You could not splice two logs together to make a ship mast. It had to be made out of one piece of wood and one tree. And when the trees were used up in Europe, the source for ship masts was the New World, particularly for England, who didn't have the pines. And if you go to the East Coast, we actually did this a few summers ago, backpacking on the Appalachian Trail with my daughters and my wife. We stopped in Wanalancet in New Hampshire to visit some friends there. And they showed us a tree that had been marked with the king's sign, the broad axe. And these were trees. The king's soldiers went into the woods, and when they found trees that were suitable for masts, they would mark them. So it was illegal to cut those trees. But the cut began on the East Coast pretty much the way they did it for 500 years, with axes and chains and no mechanization. And they kind of worked their way across the country. In the cut in northeastern Minnesota, which began really in the late 1880s, it was still families, pretty much family run. And by the end of the cut, it was industrialized. We had the rise of Weyerhaeuser and Heinz and highly mechanized lumbering. From northeastern Minnesota, they went to either the Pacific Northwest, Weyerhaeuser. Heinz went to the south after the sugar pine, and that was the end of the white pine cut. So also during the same time, we got to see wilderness. the last stands of wilderness, because the Laurentian, uh, our study area is north of the Laurentian Divide. The rivers flow north away from milling centers. So it was a little pocket that was cut, 10 years, 15 years later than much of the rest of the state, where they could take the logs down the rivers to the milling centers at St. Croix or in Minneapolis, St. Anthony Falls. And then during this time, we saw the rise of the Forest Service, and then another step into wilderness preservation. And now we're sort of managing the wilderness. So it's a great story. My family story began in Cornwall. This is actually the mine that my great grandfather worked in. He went in when he was 11 years old. And at that time, in 1881, 82, 83, Cornwall was the center of tin production in Europe. Tin is the active ingredient in bronze. So you mix tin and copper and you get bronze. So they've been mining in Cornwall for 5,000 years. This is the village where he grew up. And as the New World opened up and new sources of tin became available, the Cornish, who were very skilled miners, went all over the world. And my family ended up in Tower Sudan at the mine there. He went to work in Tower Sudan before the mine opened. So he hiked in with 200 other miners from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They took a boat to what became Duluth, hiked up the Vermilion Trail, which is about 90 miles through the woods, started to build bunkhouses and infrastructure and do open pit mining and lay away iron ore for the time when the railroad would finally make it up north. At that time, there was no logging. The thing that was valuable enough to begin developing northeastern Minnesota, north of the Laurentian, was iron ore. And once they had the railroads in for the iron ore, they could use those railroads to ship lumber up over the Laurentian Divide down to Duluth, where it was loaded on a ship and taken to the East Coast. So my family's from northeastern Minnesota, from Tower, and I grew up, and my grandmother and my aunts and uncles lived up there, my cousins, my great aunt, and it was wilderness. We were taught that this was a wilderness. We had land up there that my wife and I still use and still have on an island on Lake Vermilion, adjacent to the boundary waters. Just across from our land is where the boundary waters begins. And so the title of this tree, Forest for the Trees, is really a story of my education. One of the things I learned in college when I was getting my master's in fine arts was writing is really a process of discovery. We don't write what we know, we write what we learn as we investigate. And that was very much my experience here. I thought I knew these forests, I thought I understood them well, and I was wrong. This is a map that was put together by a guy named Marshner, and he went through all of the survey books that the original surveyors carried, small little books about yay big that they carried in their back pockets, and they would make notes. And they would say, oh, traveled through cedar stands today, or traveled through white pine, or big stand of jack pine, open prairies. And it's great. You can go to the Historical Society and get these books and actually read them, and they're kind of bent from riding in people's back pockets, and they've got dirt on them and squashed flies and stuff, and kind of written in pencil. Sometimes they're hard to read. But Marshner went through all of these books and recorded what the original forest cover of Minnesota was. And Minnesota is unique. It's one of two places in the world where four biomes meet. We've got the oak, hardwood, maple forests that kind of came through, Illinois and Wisconsin and up into Minnesota. And there's one little finger that kind of comes up towards Mille Lacs, and it ends right about, that level. We've got the Great Plains, the arid plains coming in from the west, all the way from the Rocky Mountains to the west. We've got the white pine forest, which really kind of came up over the Great Lakes, started in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and then sort of worked up over the Great Lakes and kind of under the Great Lakes, northern Wisconsin, and then northern Minnesota. Overlapping that was the boreal forest that comes down from the Arctic. So we've got these four biomes of really continental sized vegetation that overlap in northern Minnesota or in Minnesota. And here's a map of the North American continent, and you can see these forest types laid out on a continental scale. That means that as climate changes and these plant communities begin to migrate, they're going to migrate most on the edge. If you're in the middle of Nebraska and it's all Great Plains for 500 miles in any direction, things can change quite a lot before the plant communities in your area begin to change. The other thing that's unique about northern Minnesota, or Minnesota in general, is it's the headwaters of three continental-sized watersheds. The water in northern Minnesota flows up to Hudson Bay and the Arctic Ocean. From the Laurentian, it flows east into the Great Lakes and over Niagara Falls and out into the Atlantic Ocean, or it flows down the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. So we're really the heart of the continent. The big woods that began on the East Coast, most of those were burned. The white pine cut ended in northern Minnesota. And while they were cutting Minnesota, they came out with this idea that the frontier in America was closed. In the 1860s, 1870s, they began writing about, okay, well, we've conquered this continent. And so we began to see ourselves as Americans differently after the Civil War. So this is a logging camp, and they were huge affairs. They'd have 200-300 men. The rules were no thermometers, no women. They were paid about $1 a day. The food was excellent. They ate oysters on Christmas. They would bring in barrels of oysters. They made donuts for breakfast every day. A lot of pork and beans. A lot of wild game. And there were reports in northern Minnesota of buffalo in northern Minnesota. So picture much less undergrowth than there was now. These big trees, very little undergrowth, buffalo, elk, caribou, moose, of course. In our study area in northeastern Minnesota, deer were pretty rare. So they were eating really well. This is a water tanker. So how they would move the logs is this tanker has big ruts on it, and they would drag it over the snow, and they would fill this tanker with water from a lake. They would cut a hole in the lake and haul a barrel up with cross hauling a barrel to, they dump it in and lower it down and kind of, go like this and fill up the tanker. The tanker trucks had little kerosene heaters under sprinklers in the back, and they would go out at night. These guys worked from sundown to sunup, and they would go over the roads and lay down water and create these ice roads, which were basically almost like inverse railroad tracks. And then they could get their logging sleds on top of these ice roads and move huge loads with 4 horses. And notice the size of these trees, very big. And when they cut everything. This is a picture from Michigan. They like to load up huge sleds and try and go for the biggest load loaded. The logs are held on with chain that would wrap over the top of the logs. Loading these logging wagons, sleds, was the most dangerous job in the forest because these logs would break loose and people would get crushed. But as you notice, as the cut begins, the logs start to get smaller in diameter. By the end, they're dealing with poles. So that was really the history of the cut. Logging has been a migratory industry since it began. It began really in the Fertile Crescent, Iran and Iraq. Back in the, read the Gilgamesh stories, and they're talking about an area that looks a lot like rainforest. So think Oregon or Washington. And as it was cut repeatedly by the Greeks and the Romans, eventually it dried and the landscape became different. They logged all the way through Europe, ran out of mass trees and large forests for lumbering, came to the New World, started on the East Coast, moved across until they hit uh, our area in northeastern Minnesota, and then went to the South and the Pacific Northwest. And now they're working in Malaysia and South America. And we've always cut trees faster than they can grow back. This kind of gives you another picture of the forest in Minnesota pre-harvest. So the purple is the boreal forest component. The yellow is aspen, birch. The dark green is really the pine forests. The lighter green is the northern mesic forests. The gray is the oak forests. So you can see kind of how these 4 landscape types, these 4 biomes, overlapped in Minnesota. And this is after logging. A lot more aspen and birch, a lot less oak and hickory. The white pines kind of became jack white pine mixes, red pines maybe, and a lot more non-forest. Here's another graph of forested areas, pre-settlement and post-settlement. And you can see really much of the land was converted to farmland. None of the forests, except for aspen birch, are larger than they were pre-settlement. And then there's fire. I remember while I was doing this book, I was studying the forests and the logging camps and the way they harvested and where they harvested. And some friends of ours invited us to come over. Their kids had gone on a canoe trip up to Hudson Bay from the Boundary Waters, and they had a slideshow. And there was a guy at the slideshow, a friend, a neighbor, who was there, and his name was Bud Heinzelman. And they said, "Oh, well, Bud, you should meet Jeff. He's working on a book about logging in the Boundary Waters." And Bud said, "Oh, well, great. What are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking at the timber harvest and the total harvest and where these trees were cut and how the forest changed." And he goes, "Oh, well, it's about fire." And I said, "Well, no, really, we changed the forest types when we logged it." And he goes, "Yeah, but," he goes, "that didn't matter. It was fire." And I didn't really understand. I didn't understand at the time what he was talking about. But I did read some of his stuff. He was a researcher up in the Boundary Waters area uh, who studied fire, and he had estimated that pre-settlement times was about 10,000 acres a year in what is now the boundary waters of 100,000 acres burned. There was fire that moved over the landscape. His estimates were that fire moved over any given foot of land in the boundary waters once every 30 years, kind of in a mosaic. So some areas would get burned more frequently than others. The average overall was 30 years. And I kind of held on to that idea, but I didn't fully understand it. While they were cutting the boundary waters, the rest of the country had been pretty much cleared. And people were beginning to talk about forestry. They were beginning to say trees are a strategic resource that we need to preserve. We can't build cities without trees. We can't build anything without trees. We need to replant. We need to create a national forest service. Gifford Pinchot kind of came on the scene. And really, there was incredible resistance to this change until this fire here, Peshtigo, 1871. Hot, dry summer. Little fires had been burning in the cutover land for months, and then the weather changed. And what happened on that day was there was an extreme temperature inversion. So you've got the cold air on top pressing down on warmer air below. And then there was a fire that had a big enough basal area and enough energy to punch through this inversion layer. And the cold air rushes down and the hot air rushes up and the whole thing begins to turn. And instead of a fire moving as a line across the landscape, it moves in a geometric progression. So 1 acre becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, 16, and you get a plume-dominated fire. This fire consumed 1,875 square miles in about 9 hours. It hit the Green Bay area, that bay, and that was where a lot of lumber was stacked. All of this area that burned was area that had been logged. So one of the things I learned was logging doesn't mimic fire. Logging leads to fire, to more intense fires, and I'll get into that more later. But they saw the fire coming in Green Bay, and where all these lumber mills were, where the shipping docks were, and they were loading up lumber, getting it ready to move out onto the Great Lakes. And they went out into the Great Lakes, and there was a boat that was 7 miles out in the Great Lakes. And I read a report that this fire was so intense, it was sucking things in. The winds coming into the base of the fire were up to 120 miles an hour. So like tornado winds, drawing things in, sucking them up to the top, blowing them out the top. And they were 7 miles out in the lake, and burning planks from the stacks of lumber on the wharf were raining down on them. It draws in everything, rocks, all kind of buildings, materials, and blows it out the top. And you've got these burning chunks of molten material raining down outside the fire, starting more fires, increasing the base of this thing as it grows. And it's like brimstone. It's biblical. But this didn't change it. The fire that changed it, that changed the perception of Americans about fire, was Hinckley. And remember, Americans burned. We burned fields to get rid of weeds. We burned forests on the East Coast. Most of the forest east of the Mississippi was burned in order to clear land for farmland. 420 square miles burned in about 4.5 hours, 5 hours. 800 people died, they estimate. And after this fire, there was a change. People were ready for forestry. And the first goal of forestry was to conserve our forests, right? So they started the Forest Service. They put fire towers up. They strung telephone lines, the first real continental effort from the Atlantic to the Pacific to install telephone lines was for fire safety. They put up towers. After World War I and World War II, and then the Korean War, they added military technology. And this was very much of a military type of effort. The goal was set that any fire should be out by 10 a.m. the morning after it was reported. Smokey the Bear, probably the best, most effective advertising campaign in the history of marketing, was widespread and is still very, very popular. Fire was bad. All fires were bad. Became a sort of a patriotic duty to prevent forest fires. And then this was the nail in the coffin. I would make the case that the movie Bambi was probably the most effective in film in terms of changing behavior of anything that's ever been produced. And the result was, for the first time in the history of the continent, we pretty much extinguished fire. If you go, when this book came out, I wrote a screenplay about a plume dominated fire in today's world. And they had some plume dominated fires in Australia this last year. You saw them with the big cumulonimbus clouds, and the flames would go 50,000 feet. That's like 5 miles, right? And the story, so I went to Hollywood and I sold a screenplay on it. And the other writers and I were doing research for the screenplay. And we went to the Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. And it's literally like something out of a movie. A big room with big screens and a huge map of the United States and 20, 30 people on computers. And they've got sensors spread across the continent. And whenever lightning hits the ground, it records it. And they put a plane in the air and they fly over and they look down. And if it's raining and the fire's not a threat, they, leave it. If it looks like it's going to burn out of control, smoke jumpers jump in and put the fire out. And they're successful like 99% of the time. Which is remarkable. And then the other thing that happened as they created the national forests in 1910, 11, 12, they began to look at the different values of the forest. So on national forests, you can log and those return receipts. Recreation is also a use. And the forests have always been set up for the benefit of multiple users for the National Forest Service. And even going back into 1906, 1907, 1908, really after the forest really got, established in northeastern Minnesota, Superior National Forest, recreational revenues were outperforming timber at that time. And they did an interesting thing. They hired a guy, Arthur Carhart, who was a landscape architect, and they asked him to go into the boundary waters, all these lakes, these areas that had been logged, and plot sites for cabins. So what their idea was they were going to lease cabin sites to people and sort of develop the national forest with this form of recreation, this for cabin owners. And he got up there and was paddling around and finding great sites for cabins. And a strange thing happened to him. He had what he described as a spiritual experience. He realized that there was almost no place in the continent where you could travel for weeks on end in solitude with only the sounds of nature around you and very few people. And he made a suggestion. He turned in his work. Here's where the cabin sites are. But he urged the Forest Service not to do it. He said, leave it. Leave it wild. Don't develop it for cabin sites. There's something that's more important in this area. This is a unique place. And a couple of years later, at a conference, he ran into a guy named Aldo Leopold, and he started telling him his story. And Leopold had had the same experience in the Gila uh, National Forest out west. He was out there hunting, and he went like 2 weeks without running across another party, and had the same realization that we need to preserve some places outside of the press of modern society where humans can go and be in a natural environment. Um, and this idea grew and gained steam. And in 1964, they created the wilderness areas, a system of preserving some area as wilderness within the United States. This was a radically new idea. When Americans first got to this continent, the forests were really seen as something that was either that was in the way. You couldn't farm when there was forest, so you should, girdle the trees, burn them down, plant a farm. Or in the case of northeastern Minnesota, cut the trees down and mill them. And the trees in the boundary waters, most of them ended up in two places, either Colorado to build Denver, some ended up in Chicago, or they went all the way out the Great Lakes to New York City. And here is this language from the Wilderness Act. Hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain, an area of undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence, without permanent improvements or human habitation, which is protected and managed so as to preserve natural conditions, and which generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable, has outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. And this is an interesting way to phrase this. They're saying, in essence, here, that humans aren't natural, right? That there's nature, there's wilderness, there's natural systems, and then there's humans. And I remember being struck by this language at the time. And kind of like the fire stuff with Bud Heinzelman, I was focused on the trees, and I sort of just kept writing. So, how did Europeans change the North Woods? The title of the book is Forest for the Trees, How Humans Shaped the North Woods. Well, we removed the pine, white and red. We reduced the number of forest fires and acres burned dramatically across the entire continent. The fires that we did have were hotter and more intense. We increased grazing by introducing deer into the area. So as the elk and caribou and buffalo were hunted out, the last buffalo died in Itasca State Park in the early 1970s, I think, woodland buffalo. I think they're trying to reestablish elk kind of in the northwest corner of the state now. The caribou are gone. But the deer are a different type of grazer than those animals, and that's had a really big impact on the way our forests progress. And then we threw this legislative fence around this area of northeastern Minnesota, the boundary waters, and called it a wilderness, which was an amazing thing to do. So when that happened, this is a picture of Bud Heinzelman, and he went through the boundary waters and looking for trees that the loggers missed. And I looked at his maps, and I did a lot of looking myself, and it's just a few pockets. You know, 2-3 acre stands that somehow they were logging through the winter, and then the spring came and the roads started to break up and they couldn't get to those last few trees back in the corner of some area that they were logging that year, and they'd pretty much logged everything else out. So they were moving their operations. So little pockets, nothing larger than maybe 10 or 12 acres survived, but some survived. And he went and took core samples because old growth trees will typically survive a wildfire, but they'll be scarred. And so he was able to go and map the fires in the boundary waters. So you can see he's got fires going back to 1801, 1845, and he drew lines around them. And I'd kind of like to show you the progression of these fires. So these are, 1610 to 1692. And you can see where the fires are burning. That black outline is the outline of the boundary waters. And if you see that area kind of just a little bit to the left of center on the bottom where it looks like a Y, those are basically the bays of Jackfish Bay coming up in there, of Jackfish and Pipestone Bays. And that was really an area of significant logging. There was a lot of white pine in there. And where the area was logged, obviously the trees were gone, so there was no record. But look at this progression of fires. 1712, kind of burning and then burning over the same areas again and again and again and again. And I read some old journals from the voyeurs, and they described some of these fires, and they were low intensity ground fires. So one trapper from up there, one voyageur, complained that he had to resole his moccasins again because they'd had to cross so many fires he'd burned out his boots. And you can see how the fires kind of played out on the landscape up until the 1920s. And again, that area in the middle was logged, and so there wasn't a good record. And you see some areas on the edges that were also logged, and therefore there was no record. And then an interesting thing happened. In 1999, we had a derecho, straight line winds. I think they were about 70 miles an hour on July 4th. And here's the map of what blew down. And it's pretty much the area that we logged. So the areas that were logged grew up in aspen and some birch, and then it blew down. And what we had in the boundary waters were thousands of acres of pickup sticks, of basically the largest bonfire in the country just waiting for a match. What do we do about this? This is something that could become a plume-dominated fire. There's the Gunflint Trail blowdown. So what the Forest Service did was they went in and they broke the landscape up into squares and set fires, actually, to burn some of this up. But this story of removing the large trees, and then they grow up in the small trees that then become a fire hazard, is the story of fire in America. Remember, I said they put every fire out by 10 a.m. So the only fires that they can't really put out, right, are the fires that are started under conditions that are so adverse they can't control them. So we, by our policy, are selecting for fires that burn when it's very hot, very dry, very windy. And we've changed the nature of fire in the United States on our landscapes. So you think back to that Wilderness Act saying, natural fires versus, man-made. Well, now we had kind of a dilemma. So they did deal with it. They did burn it. And the Forest Service, following Bud Heinzelman's original studies kind of in the 70s, put in place a wildland fire use rule for natural resources. So they said, okay, going back to the 1600s, we can prove that there was fires in the boundary waters. So obviously that was one of the natural functions in that system. So what we'll do is, if it's a man-made fire, if somebody lets a campfire get away from them, we'll put it out. If it's a natural fire, like a lightning strike, we'll let it burn. And remember, I said that with Bud Heinzelman's model, they were looking at about 10,000 acres a year within the boundary waters burned. And under this wildland fire use rule in the 1984, I think is when they came in with it, we were getting about 1,000 acres a year burning. And that was a dilemma, right? And it was kind of awkward because I wrote the book and sent it to the publisher, and they scheduled the release date, and it was getting ready to go to printing. And my wife had our second daughter, and I was fact checking the entire book, and I came across that discrepancy. What was the difference? Pre-settlement, we've got 10,000 acres a year burning. Post-settlement, we've got 1,000 acres a year burning. And I couldn't resolve this. And I called, and as I started to research, what I came to understand was that the Native Americans, the American Indians who lived there, burned it. They set fires. That the advance of white pine across the continent was fire dependent. That the forest types and the mixes that we found were fire dependent. That the Shenandoah Valley out east, which was, early settlers remarked on just the incredible abundance of game in that area, that was burned almost every year. That was the way the Native Americans managed the landscape to increase deer herds. In northern Minnesota, they burned to remove underbrush, to keep bugs down, to make it easier to travel, to improve blueberries, to improve grazing for the elk and the caribou and the moose and everything that lived up there. On the Great Plains, this time of year, the tribes would be further south in the Great Plains, and they would start to set fires to the grass and drive the buffalo north. And then in the fall, they would start to set fires in the northern plains and drive the buffalo herds south and follow them down south. And the buffalo herds would return in the late fall to the southern plains where new grass was coming up because it had been burned the year before. I learned that when Columbus landed in the Americas, there was more people living in the Americas than lived in Europe at the same time. And since I did the research on this book, that number has increased. Anytime some researcher sits down and tries to estimate the number of Native Americans that lived in the Americas pre-settlement, the estimate goes up. The other thing, we had ice, the ice age 10, 15,000 years ago, 12,000, 15,000 years ago covered northern Minnesota. We try and estimate when Native Americans got here. And that number is getting longer and longer and longer and longer ago. And I began to understand that the boundary waters, this area that I, kind of grew up in, wasn't an ecosystem that was in sort of steady state, but it was a cultural artifact of the people who lived there before Europeans arrived. And what happened to all these people? Most of them died of successive waves of European diseases, smallpox and things like that. Estimates are, 8, 9 out of 10. So a huge issue. But since we've been, and these numbers are a little bit out of date, but you can kind of see our fire program was pretty good until like the mid 1980s, and then it starts to tick up. More acres burned, more fires. Under the fire one, you see that big drop. That was they changed the way they measured fires, so that was a glitch in the data. Fatalities start to go up. I don't have the numbers from 2010 to 2020, but you can imagine they're much, much steeper. And here's what's happening. Because of the way we've been managing our fires, combined with hotter, drier weather from climate change, we're getting more fires. And where people are building, they're building their homes kind of outside cities in these what the Forest Service calls wildland fire interface. So out in the woods a little bit, where I know many of you live, and I have a place. They're burning. But here's an interesting thing. So this is a neighborhood that burned, and you'll see some trees still survived. And if you look closely, in the about 3/4 of the way up on the left-hand side, you'll see a house. Near the top right-hand corner, you'll see a house that didn't burn. Kind of in the middle on the right-hand side, you'll see a house that didn't burn. Why didn't these places burn? How did they survive the fire? The newspapers record them as miracle homes, right? So here's the fire coming right at the house. It's gone. It's a goner, right? This place is going to burn down. No, it didn't. Why not? Why do some houses survive wildfires and others don't? So while we were doing research for the film, after I published this book, oh, and by the way, I called the editor at the Historical Society and I said, okay, so I was wrong about everything. Bud Heinzelman was right all those years ago. It wasn't really the story of logging and how humans changed the North Woods, shaped the North Woods, isn't the story of logging. It's really a story about fire. And I laid out my whole case, and she said, yeah, that's great. And I had this new baby at home. And I said, so I need to rewrite it. And she said, oh, okay, that's great. Yeah, there's a great focus. And I said, well, how much of an extension can I get? And she said, oh, none. It's due at the end of the month. So I told my wife goodbye, and I went to the office for a month and rewrote the book kind of in the last month with a lot of this new information. After we sold the movie and we were doing research, we came across a guy named Jack Cohen, and he does fire research. And this is one of his plots. You can see at the bottom the smoke jumping shelters and instrumentation. And I want to play something here for you that I think will be really interesting, particularly for people who have a place in the woods. And let me get this going for you here. Jack Cohen was an interesting guy.
This is the experimental crown fire study area in the boreal forest of the Northwest Territories of Canada. The plots are 500 feet on a side, or about 5.5 acres in area. Fire breaks 100 to several hundred feet wide surround them.
If you could chat me and let me know if you can hear it or not.
We ignited the crown fires with a truck-mounted device called a TerraTorch. Using this ignition technique, we produced active spreading crown fires under moderate weather conditions. The wind speeds range from 10 to 15 miles per hour, temperatures from 75 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and relative humidities from 20 to 40%. In addition to home ignition research, the crown fire experiments included studies of wildland fire physics, fire shelter and firefighter clothing tests, smoke emission studies, and other wildland fire research. You are looking at the downwind side of the experimental plot as the crown fire burns to the end. All of our crown fires produce strong fire-induced winds and turbulence in the immediate fire vicinity. Fire whirls commonly occurred on the downwind edge of the plot. At the bottom center of the scene, you can see the nearest wall section at 33 feet from the plot edge. It was positioned to face the middle portion of the plot's downwind side. This scene shows wall sections from the edge of the downwind side of the crown fire plot. A thermally protected box with heat-resistant glass enclosed the camera. The wall section at the left is 33 feet from the forest edge. The distant wall sits at 98 feet from the edge. Oh yes, we occasionally had equipment failures, as with this instrument tower. The crown fire scorched the near wall without ignition. The distant wall did not scorch. This was another of our experimental crown fires. The fire intensities for this burn were greater than in the previous case. This crown fire demonstrated the turbulence generated by these fires. Note how the flames can momentarily extend beyond the forest edge. As you will see, flames extended from the plot to contact the wall section at 33 feet. You are looking at the near wall section with a clothing test on the ground at the lower right. As the crown fire approaches, you can see smoke, ash, and firebrands blowing past the camera, immediately followed by flames. At this point, the flames contacted the wall and ignited it. The wall at 98 feet did not ignite or even scorch during this fire. Keep in mind that you have observed the full crown fire duration at the downwind edge. It lasted about 50 seconds. When the crown fire burned out, the wall section could not maintain flaming. For this next crown fire, you can see the wall section and mannequins for firefighter clothing tests. Notice the increasing fire-induced wind blowing toward the plot as the crown fire approaches. Firebrands are falling into the firebreak and igniting the remaining woody debris. I removed surface fuel from around the base of the wall section to keep a surface fire from igniting it. You can see the wall section darkening as it scorches from the approaching flames. The wall sections were exposed to radiation and convection from the flames, as well as firebrands. As the view clears, you see a scorched but not ignited wall section, nicely framed by the cracked lens. In addition to wall sections, I also use small structures for more comprehensive testing. The house is 25 by 25 feet, with each wall covered one half by white vinyl siding and the other half covered by cedar lap siding. The windows were double-pane plate glass in a vinyl casement sash. Each wall had instruments to measure the heat received by the wall, as well as temperatures of the outside and inside window surfaces. The roof was covered with fiberglass composition shingles with metal eave covering, metal soffits, and no gutters. We chose the materials to represent common construction in the Northwest Territories. There was 30 feet of clearance between the house and the forest. 70 feet beyond that had the surface fuels removed, including the understory black spruce. The jack pine overstory remained unthinned but pruned to a height of 6 feet. I had hoped for a crown fire to head toward the house, but a wind shift caused the fire to flank past. The good news was that it provided an opportunity to observe and measure a low-level exposure and the resulting effects. You are viewing the house from the edge of the 30-foot clearance. The flames in the windows are reflections of the crown fire spreading past the house. The low heat exposure neither broke the window glass nor scorched the cedar wood siding. However, the low heat exposure did significantly damage the vinyl. Notice how it is starting to buckle below the window. Vinyl siding doesn't readily ignite from firebrands or from heating without direct flame contact, so it's not highly ignitable. However, if it falls away, leaving unscreened openings to the house interior, for example the attic space, firebrands can enter and potentially ignite the home. Many of the homes destroyed during the 1998 Florida fires ignited in this way. I couldn't ignite the house with a crown fire, so how about burning pine needles off the roof? We collected dead pine needles and spread them on the composition shingle roof to a depth of about 1.5 inches. I wanted to test what I had seen during actual wildland urban fires, that composition shingle roofs didn't ignite and burn even when pine needles burned on the roof. The composition shingle roof demonstrated its ignition resistance. This is another of our experimental crown fires approaching the downwind edge of the burn plot. At the left of the wall section, you can see a clothed mannequin used for a firefighter safety zone study. To the left of that, you can see aluminum fire shelters being tested. This crown fire was the most intense we produced, as close to a religious experience as we could achieve. The model calculations overestimated the measured heat received from the other experimental crown fires. This was the only crown fire where heat measurements at the near wall section were as great as the model estimates. The 33-foot wall section ignited, and the model estimated that ignition should have occurred at 66 feet. The wall sections at 66 and 98 feet did not ignite. Only light scorch occurred at 66 feet, and no scorch occurred at 98 feet. As with a previous wall section you saw ignite, the flaming self-extinguished when the crown fire burned out.
Hello. So there was a few takeaways there for people that have homes in the forest. The intense heat of a fire moving through the forest is about 50 seconds. So that intense blast of heat that will set things on fire, and really when you saw that wall scorching, what it was the vapors coming off, as the wood gets heated and the vapors come off the wood, it begins to scorch and that starts to burn. And when the heat is removed, the fire goes out. 33 feet is the magic number. You want to be away from the edge of the forest. 66 feet, big crown fire comes at you. You're going to get light scorching, but you won't burn down. So in those homes that burned down, what was it that caused them to burn down? Well, maybe the forest was too close, or maybe they had something that was flammable, like a wood pile stacked under the porch. Or I saw one video of a house that was starting to burn, and somebody had swept out their cabin and then swept to the front door and walked outside and set the broom by the front door, and the straw in the bottom of the broom was starting to catch from firebrands coming in, and the firefighter just took the broom and threw it in the yard and saved the house. Raffia doormats, or things that you hang on your front door that can catch on fire. Everything should be screened so firebrands can't blow into an open vent or anything like that. But at 33 feet, if there's nothing flammable on your house or around your house and the house is sealed, it should survive. These experiments that they did really led to this whole Firewise thing that the Forest Service has been promoting. And if you are in a wilderness area, like we are, you can actually get a grant from the Forest Service. I believe they're still available to put a sprinkler system. So you hear about a fire coming, and there's literally a sprinkler spigot on the roof of your house, and it's connected to, our place doesn't have electricity, so, or electricity can go out in these fires in many cases, so they're connected to a gasoline powered pump that pumps lake water or well water or river water, whatever you've got, and just puts in a sprinkler going about 40 feet around, covering the house, and then 40 feet beyond it, and wets the whole area down, and that will save a house. And so what the smoke jumpers or the firefighters will do is they have a map that has where this equipment has been installed. They go to those homes first thing when the fire is starting out. They start the sprinkler, they let it run for a tank of gas, they wet everything down and save the home. And then there's this. If you look at this picture here, it's a little hard to see, but at the bottom edge of the forest, it's unthinned. The top edge of that forest, they moved the stems from 2,400 stems um, per hectare to 500 stems. They spaced the stems of the trees from 4.1 or from 2.6 meters to 4.1 meters. And they had the inner crown spacing. And this is a pretty easy thing to judge for yourself. Look through like a paper towel tube up at the trees and see how much air there is between them, right? And get a measurement on that, a guesstimate. And in this forest, they thinned it from a space of about 1.2 meters to 3.6 meters. And then they ran fire through it. On the top picture, you can see fire passing through an untreated plot. And what happens is it starts on the ground, it climbs up to the crowns very quickly using ladder fuels. So low branches. Let's say you have a big white pine tree that's maybe 70 or 80 feet tall, but underneath it, you got balsam fir growing and some other stuff. Well, a fire will come along the ground, it'll hit those ladder fuels. The flames will carry up into the crown, and in the crowns are where the fire can really start moving, because that's where the wind is. On the bottom picture, you see the fire moving through the forest, and then about the middle of the picture is where the thinning starts. And this is the forest afterwards. Just little tiny fires burning on the ground, nothing really starting, no danger. So if your house is in the woods, you want to make sure that you don't have anything within 33 feet of it that is flammable, that will ignite, like straw or raffia or woodpile or things like that. Little fine fuels that will carry flame. And then moving out into the forest, you probably want to thin it some. Space the trees out a little farther, remove the stuff that's on the ground, the balsam fir, and trim the branches up 6 or 8 feet from the ground. So with the fires that we've been having, greater intensity, anybody who's been camping can picture this. If you're camping and you're trying to start a fire, you use tiny little sticks, and then you put on, maybe finger-sized sticks, and then maybe something as big as your wrist, and the fire builds. If you take a big round log, maybe 2 feet in diameter, and you put that on the fire, it goes out, right? So logging removes those big old trees that are fire resistant and typically don't burn in a wildfire unless they've got ladder fuels that have grown up underneath, and replaces it with smaller trees that are more prone to drought and more prone to fire. While we were doing the research for this film, we ended up going to the smoke jumping camp in Colorado, and there was this cowboy guy there also named Jack, big handlebar mustache, cowboy boots. He was about 6'5", and he was the fire chief for Jackson County. Um, you may remember the Haman Fire. Well, if you look, this purple area that you see kind of in the middle of the picture, Jack became concerned that fuel loads were building outside Denver. Denver is kind of the top of the picture, right? Those are the suburbs of Denver leading into Denver, that lighter area at the top. And so he decided what he was going to do was do a prescribed burn. He was going to start a fire when it was cooler and it was wetter and they could control it, and burn the understory, set a low intensity fire to clear out the fuel load. And they did that. But the smoke started pouring down the canyon into Denver, and everybody complained about the smoke. Go put it out. This is terrible. We can't breathe. And so they put the fire out. They did not get to burn everything they had wanted to burn. Well, a few years later, uh, you might remember the Haman Fire. It was one of the first really big fires that we had, 2002. In the lower left-hand corner, you see that red dot. And it was a disgruntled or a Forest Service employee that had broken up with her boyfriend, or maybe it was her husband, and she had these letters from him, and she burned them in a fire grate, and the wind came and blew them into the brush, and it started a fire. And the fire started ripping through the forest and headed towards Denver, right? And it started down at the bottom and moved up, and it hit that area that he had burned. Here is actually a map of it. The stuff at the top is where he did his low intensity burn. The stuff below it is the Haman Fire. And what happened was it got there where he had done a prescribed burn, and the fire fell down to the ground where they could fight it, and they got it out and basically saved the city of Denver. The Man Gulch Fire was really the first fire where we lost a lot of smoke jumpers, and I'll kind of skip ahead on that. Um, it was tragic, but I will say one thing about this. The guy who survived, one person was able to get up to the top of the ridge, this ridge here. You see this at the top of the picture is where the rocks are. Where that yellow X is where a number of firefighters were overcome by the fire and were killed. One person made it up over the rocks into the top. A couple kind of got close to the rocks and survived the fire, but died the next day. But one guy, the leader of the group, saw the fire coming up the canyon towards him, and he bent down and he started a fire of his own in the grass at his feet. And the wind took it and burned out a big area of black. And as the wildfire was approaching, he laid down in this black area, and the fire went around him. And he survived where other people didn't. This was a new technique for the Forest Service, this idea of back burns and setting burns to create black space to protect yourself. It was an old idea for the Native Americans. I read one account of a Native American tribe kind of going across the plains, and they could see the wagon train a little ways in the distance, and they saw the smoke and they saw the fire coming, and the wagon train all pulled up, and the people got out, and they got their blankets, and they were trying to, as the fire came, they were trying to beat the flames down and so forth. Well, the American Indians just started a fire of their own in the grass and let it burn, and then got into the center of the black, and the fire just burned around them. Meanwhile, the people in the wagon train were all killed by the fire. And this is where I'd like to end. So in 1909, this was the Bitterroot National Forest. This was not dissimilar to what was in northeastern Minnesota in the Boundary Waters. Some of the surveying accounts that I read, they rode horses in the area around Ely and Tower and northeastern Minnesota. They described it as park-like, with grasses underneath and big overstory. These old growth trees that grow up, they lose their lower branches, and you end up with this kind of long, straight trunk with no lower branches and little tufts of branches up at the top. A fire would go through here. It would stay down on the ground. It would not reach the crown. Things are too spaced apart. But after roughly 39 years, 40 years of fire suppression, this is what that same space looks like. And here was the same space in 1989. That's a fire hazard. That's why we are having so much trouble with wildfire in the United States today, because so much of our land looks like this. And that's what we're trying to avoid. I remember when we sold the movie and wrote the script, and we had a producer in Hollywood, and he was reading the script, and the Malibu fires were burning. This was 10 years ago, big fires in Malibu. And I get this panicked phone call from him as he's reading the script we wrote about these big, fires, action adventure film. And he had been sitting out by his pool, and the ash from the Malibu fires was falling on the script. And he said, "Oh my God. So, like, what's the deal? Am I in danger?" And I said, "Well, let me see if I've got the location of your house right. You're at the top of a ridge." Yeah, yeah. And I said, "At the end of a lane where there's a cul-de-sac at the end." And he goes, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, and you look down the slope from your house, and it's got 12 to 14 foot high brush. And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay, so that's definitely a place that's going to burn, because fire moves uphill, and you're at the top of the hill, and that's where you are." And ultimately, that area did burn in some of the fires a few years later. So, looking at northeastern Minnesota, looking at the boundary waters, we can see kind of the sweep of human interaction with this continent. These ideas of preserving our trees for industry and building, to preserving something that might not ever really have existed, this idea of wilderness, to now beginning to see the forest for what it really is, and how to manage it in a different way. Um, the difficulty is the Forest Service gets their budget from Congress. When they want to do a prescribed burn, they have to budget that in advance. So that's in the ask. Once a wildfire starts and it's a disaster, the checkbook is open. And we're spending billions of dollars a year fighting wildfires. These are huge operations with planes and water bottles and batteries for their headlamps and lots of people and all kinds of logistics, and it's a huge industry. And once the fire starts, it's paid for. But if you want to do the prescribed burn, that's got to come out of the budget. And so we really need to kind of change our thinking on this, and really begin to look at the forest differently. And one of the things I learned in the process of writing this book is what you know is less important than what you ask. The questions really are the key. And I had a class when I was in college with Ken Kesey. He's the guy who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he told us this in class. The answer is never the answer. What's really interesting is the mystery. If you seek the mystery instead of the answer, you'll always be seeking. I've never seen anybody really find the answer. They think they have, so they stop thinking. But the job is to seek mystery, evoke mystery, plant a garden in which strange plants grow and mysteries bloom. The need for mystery is greater than the need for an answer. And I'll end on that. I've got some time for questions. We had scheduled this for an hour and a half. does anybody have any questions? You can use the chat feature and I will answer them. I'll wait a second here. I mean, it was a fascinating process working on this book. I started out and was really focused on the mechanics of what was cut when and and how and where the wood went and how much wood was produced. Um, the forest north of Duluth had more standing timber than the forests in the Pacific Northwest in the Olympic Peninsula. And anybody who's been out there has seen how huge those trees were. So there was a lot of really big trees up there. And I was focused on that. And the film, the film actually came out. The question is, Michael Gallagher asks, is the film out and ready for viewing? And it is, but it was changed. So it was, I think it had Jeff Bridges in it, and it really became a disaster film about one small group of smoke jumpers that were overrun in, I believe it was Colorado, 7 or 8 years ago. Yeah, I knew that a lake was named for Heinzelman. I was really glad to see that. His work is fascinating. He was a really interesting guy. Charles Dayton says, did you know that a lake has been named for Heinzelman in the Quatico, honoring his work on the 1978 Act and his pioneering work with fire in Canada and the U.S.? And yeah, I did know that. And he was an amazing guy. I was really lucky to get a chance to meet him before he died. Are your sources for the original cover pre-settlement available? And they are. And here's a lot of my sources. The book is heavily sourced. So you can, if you have the book or you get it online, you can find it there. I've been doing some history work around the Paul Bunyan State Forest, which led me naturally into a lot of logging and forest history in case you have any sources that might overlap. There's some, particularly on the transportation routes and where the logging railways went, and but specifically with the timber amounts that were cut and hauled. That was really my work was really centered in the Boundary Waters area. But if you go to the Minnesota Historical Society, it's probably easier now because they have a lot of their stuff online. I think they can help you, and you can find those original surveyor books that are really interesting. The name of the film, it has we called it Flashpoint. And then when it was rewritten, it was changed, and unfortunately it came out 3 years ago when California was burning and that there were massive wildfires. So the film was released, and then 2 days later, California started burning, and so they kind of pulled it from the theaters because it's sort of in bad taste at that point. And I think it's got something. They changed the title though. It's Heroes or something. So yeah. Joe Snyder asks, thought the logging info was fascinating. Think we can get to a phase where we apply conservation principles to sulfide mining and water before we wreck them. I don't know. I mean, one of the things I saw in this, and we see repeatedly, maybe today is a good example, the period we're at now. Humans tend to just kind of roll along on what we know and not really change our behavior until there is a crisis. Until we see something massive like the Hinckley Fire, which incidentally was the same day as the Chicago fire. So real hot, dry, windy day. But yeah, I don't know, Joe. we're, Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, we're trying, but it often seems to take a crisis. Any other questions? I'll wait a minute or two. Uh, Thank you, Joe. Says well done. I appreciate your kind words. Any other questions? Well, if you go to our website, Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, .org, you can email me after the fact. Rich Halverson says, very cool. Thank you. Book is on order. Great. Yeah, buy the book. Become a member of Minnesota Lakes and Rivers and support our work. And Carrie Griffiths says, I second that. Very interesting. I'm glad. And again, April 22nd, Lost in the Wild, which I have read, and it's a great book. And then May 15th, Canoeing with the Cree, which is also a really wonderful kind of adventure story, great summertime reading. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, stay home, and be well. And I appreciate you taking the time to spend the afternoon with me.